squared on here. My screen is like stretched.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on there.
I don't either. But okay. Well, it's nice to like meet you face to face, sort of.
Yes, nice to meet you too. I was realizing because I was recounting back like how I'm like, okay, who referred this Amy to me? And I was like, and it was I believe Jen Christie
Yeah,
and or my sister Dana or
yeah.
both.
I know both of them, so. Well, I knew your sister at one point. I was an intern at a church, and we somehow, I don't remember how, but we met somehow during the course of
Yeah,
that church. So,
yeah, and I actually I have no idea how. Wait, where was it in California? Was it in Kentucky? Where was it?
Michigan.
What
In Rochester, Michigan.
was this? Was this while she was at Pepperdine? Yeah, it must have been. Or was
Uh,
it before then?
she was still, I mean, she was a teenager. This was like several years ago. Yeah. So I was working at Rochester Church of Christ, and I think she must have been at like a youth function that was happening in Rochester because they have a big youth gathering called Illuminate every year, and she came to that, and uh, I met her because she was playing her ukulele, and I'm a musician, and I was trying to like mix and mingle with all the kids and get to know them, and I was like, oh, cool. And so that's how I know her.
Oh, I thought it for some reason. I was thinking it was like through Jen Christie or like at Pepperdine somehow. I
Isn't
had
that
no
funny?
idea. Yeah, yeah. It is
Yeah.
very. I mean, it's a very tight circle that we keep here in
Yes,
the
it
church.
is. It is. I mean, you go, I mean, anywhere in the world and you find a Church of Christ and you have a million connections. I
Yeah,
remember
it's
when
very.
I was a little girl, my dad's a preacher in the Churches of Christ. And so I remember we took a mission trip to Singapore, like tiny island, Southeast Asia, Singapore. And like we were touring a place called Sentosa, which is like an even smaller island. And it's like kind of an amusement park island. And like we get over to Sentosa and this man comes running up and like knows who my dad is. And that's when I realized like there's no escaping the Church of Christ bubble. Like it is everywhere. You could go
Yeah,
and
that's
I'm
very true.
sure.
It's very true.
Yeah. Hey,
Well, anyway,
did
huh?
you just get married?
I did. I just got married.
Congrats.
Actually, I wanted to ask you because, well, welcome to the show. You are Amy McLaughlin Sheasby.
Yeah.
Sheasby. I've been pronouncing it wrong. I knew someone with a Sheasby last name, or that's how they
Yeah.
pronounced it. So now I know. But I wondered because I was like, because I've had a couple of conversations with people where I'm like, wait, do you have the hyphen or do you not have the hyphen?
Yeah. So it's legally there, but sometimes I don't always acknowledge it.
Okay. So legally you have the hyphen.
Yes.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Because there was somebody else who I like put a hyphen, and it was like, no, there's no hyphen. I was like, okay. It gets very, it can get very confusing, for people. Uh, right now I have no hyphen or an addition of another name. But yes, I did just get married.
Very nice. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. Um, Anyway, just to sort of start off, I don't know if you have any questions for me or, like I said, thanks for participating in the podcast and just helping out. And
Yeah.
it's tough to get people to create content sometimes, and I understand because everyone's busy and doing a million things. But I really appreciate anyone who's willing to help out,
Yeah.
and just share. I'm collecting voices. That's what I'm doing here.
Mhm.
Uh, But I just to kind of start out, I've listened to a little. I listened to the Abilene Summit from like last year, I think. It was good, by the way, awesome. Um, uh, and I kind of wanted to know, even though that gave a little bit of your background, just for the audience, what's your background? What tradition do you come from? Where are you at now?
Yeah.
Et cetera, et cetera.
And if I draw on too long, cut me off and ask me a different question.
Oh, no problem.
I am a preacher after all, so I can be a bit loquacious. So I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I was born into a preacher's family. My dad's a preacher in Churches of Christ. He preaches for North Atlanta Church of Christ in Atlanta. And I would say, in our home, I'm the youngest of 5, and I'm the only girl. And in my home, my family wasn't super concerned with developing gender constructs. And it wasn't a thing. Like, it wasn't intentional by any means. They just weren't anxious about it. Nobody was trying to make anybody anything. And so naturally, with 4 brothers, I learned how to work on cars and learned how to repair things just like my brothers. And I also loved to be girly too. My mom is very girly, and but I didn't think about it in terms of this is what's a man and this is what's a woman. I think what I learned about gender was largely inherited in the church, and as we know, Churches of Christ kind of, we have a traditional set of particularities for gender, and so none of my brothers really got the preaching bug.
Okay, I gotcha.
One of my brothers did become a missionary, but I guess I discovered that I was good at public speaking in high school. I'd always loved language. I loved to write. I'd always enjoyed communication. And I've always really valued community and social justice, and in some way, shape, or form, ever since I was a kid, had a deep appreciation for prophetic voices in the community who are calling people to a higher standard, calling people to protect the marginalized. And I assumed that role even as a child without thinking about it.
Well, you are the youngest of 5. Yes. I'm the oldest of 5, so yes. That's what you guys do, isn't it? Like,
it is. I think so. We kind of pick up all the pieces. So, and so yeah, I went to. I guess growing up, I figured out along the way that I was a lot like my dad, and I think he saw that in me too. And he wasn't worried about it. He wasn't concerned about it. He didn't try to muffle it. He just decided to tend to it. And so both he and my mom were very vigilant about praying for my future ministry when I was a kid. And my dad took me with him to hospital visits and would take me with him to the office. And he really let me into his world. I think because he saw something that I didn't notice yet. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until I got to college that I realized I have to do ministry. It's all I want to do. It's everything I think about. It's what's on my heart when I wake up and when I go to bed. I have to do this, and I don't know what that looks like. And
so oh no, are you still okay? You're still there. All right, so you've sort of grown up with this idea that you're going to do ministry. I mean, like you said, your parents weren't muffling it. No one's saying, no, you can't do this, at least in your family, which is probably the most important place where that can happen. Because it's similar in my family. I have a little bit more of an ecumenical sort of extended family, so it's a little bit different. Yeah. But it really came from within my family, not some of my extended family that can be a little bit more what do you say, I don't know, combative. Yeah. But within my own family, my parents were great and everything. I mean, they're always trying to just, grow you up with whatever gifts you have. I'm wondering though, if so for me, I didn't ever consider the idea of preaching until I was in like my late 20s, like my mid to late 20s. Is this something that like was where you're like 3 years old and your dad's a preacher and you're like, I'm gonna be a preacher, or is it something, or was it something that kind of surprised you later in life, or like maybe when you were a teenager, or maybe even further on, where you're like, wait a second, I'm a good speaker, or I can write, or I have this background,
Right.
I should be able to preach as well, where there isn't this like caution tape around the pulpit. Like, what was sort of this like was there a moment or like an epiphany where you're like, wait, I can do this, or I should be able to?
There was both and. Like I said, like my parents were very actively, I guess the theme of prophetic speaking is going to keep coming up. My parents were very prophetic in my life as a kid. And so my dad said things when I was a kid like, I can't wait till we're both preaching at the same church. Or I can't wait to see you grow up and use your speaking gifts and things like that. And so, I kind of laughed it off as a kid. I just thought, oh, Dad, because he said lots of things. He also used to say, like, I can't wait till you're a rock star and things like that, because I'm a musician. So, like, he always dreamed big, So I just kind of, it's not that I didn't take it seriously. I think, tucked it away somewhere else. And then, as you know, it's really hard to dream of your future, a possibility that you've never seen. And so I never, ever saw or heard a woman preacher, ever. I was actually the first woman I ever heard preach.
Wait, you yourself were the first woman?
And so it was, I didn't know it was a possibility. I am tenacious, and I've always been stubborn, so, like, if I had thought of the possibility, I would have gone for it anyways. But, like, I just hadn't conceived of it. And so I went to Lipscomb for undergrad and started off as an English major, and then took my first Bible minor class, and that was like a big moment for me where I realized there's nothing else that I really want to do. And kind of that whole that waking up to the fact that this is what I live and breathe, that this is something I have to do. Well, then it was my junior year of undergrad, and I kind of accidentally signed up for a preaching class. It was called Communicating the Gospel, which I thought sounded like a good thing to do. And it was with Dr. David Fleer, and I didn't know him at all at the time. And I got to the class. It was an evening class, and there were 2 other girls in the class.
Oh, there were other girls. That's.
It was big, because I had gotten used to having classes where I'm the only girl.
Oh,
and
okay.
So this was like, you were doing well at the time if you had a couple of other girls with you. And so, are you frozen? Are you still? Okay, good. It keeps, every now and then it freezes, so I'm like.
It's okay.
And so we look over the syllabus before Dr. Fleer gets in, and I'm like, is this a preaching class? And I turned to the girls next to me, I'm like, is this a preaching class? And they were like, what? And we all start like kind of realizing, like, what have we gotten ourselves into? And so I turn around and look at all my male classmates, and I'm like, is this a preaching class? And they were like, yes. And I was like, oh my gosh, what? And I was like, how many of you have preached before? And every single one of my male classmates had preached before. And of course, none of the girls had. So we're like, oh, great. Like, this is going to be horrible. Well, then Dr. Fleer comes in. Do you know Dr. David Fleer?
I don't think so.
Okay. If you ever meet him, you will love him. He's one of the best preachers I've ever heard, and he's a brilliant teacher. And he's kind of everywhere. Like, you could run into him at Pepperdine, you could run into him at Lipscomb, you can run into him at Rochester. He's everywhere. But it was his class, And he comes in, and for me, growing up in a preacher's home, I think the the art of preaching had grown dull for me. I love my dad. He's one of the best preachers I've ever heard. But when you're a preacher's kid, like you just kind of, you think you've heard it all, and so I was kind of bored with preaching, thinking it's really not that effective and not that important. And Dr. Fleer came in and just opened this window to another world that I think I once knew at one point but needed to be reminded of, and that is just like the immense power of words and how critical it is for people to provide words to shape the Christian community. And it just like blew my mind, totally captivated me, and I didn't know what to do about that. So the final project was, preaching a sermon for the class, and I didn't know how to do that, and I knew I was really awesome at writing exegetical papers. So my passage was Mark chapter 5, and that's the story of Gerasene demoniac and the pigs, of course, the pigs that dive off the cliff. And so that was my text, and I exegeted that text like crazy and wrote a really good paper, and that was like an A+ exegetical paper, but I also knew it wasn't a sermon, and I didn't have any idea what to do. So I'm like feverishly editing this thing. Like every chance I get, I'm like going home to work on this sermon, freaking out. And then I find out that my parents are going to come to Nashville to like listen. One of the elders from their church has like a small plane, like a private plane, and he was flying to, I know, he was flying to Nashville because he's super plugged in at Lipscomb, and he offered my parents like, hey, you want to jump on my airplane and go hear your daughter preach? So they come to Nashville. So they get to my apartment, and it's like an hour before go time, and I'm still editing my paper, and I'm just like panicking. And my dad was like, Amy, at this point, there's nothing else you can do. Like, you need to print it. You've just got to pray, and whatever's going to happen is going to happen.
That's
so
true.
we go, and we go to the amphitheater where all the sermons are taking place, and a few of my classmates go before me, and like some of them did awesome, and then some of them, it was like they have other really strong spiritual gifts, and it was okay though, but what I realized was happening is Dr. Fleer was giving like an open critique after the sermon. So like you finish your sermon, and then the class gets to make a comment, and then Dr. Fleer is going to like say something he likes about it, and then he's going to critique it like in front of everybody. And he's not holding back. We've had a semester with him. He's not holding back.
Yeah.
So everybody's just terrified. And so then he says, okay, we're going to take a quick break, but after our break, Amy, it's your turn. So I take my manuscript, and I run out of the amphitheater, and I run to the bathroom, and I hide in a stall, and I'm just like, this is all I've got. Like, you're going to have to do something with this because I've got nothing. And my mom comes in, and she was like, are you praying? And I was like, yeah. And she was like, Amy, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. Like, so she prayed over me in the bathroom, and then we go back out there, and I hand Dr. Fleer my manuscript, and I walk down to the stage, and that was the first time I ever heard a woman preach, was my own voice. And it was a kind of an amazing moment because I didn't think about it. It wasn't like, oh, that's a high-pitched voice, or like, oh, that sounds ultra-feminine. It was just, I was just really captivated by this hard work I'd poured in and needed to share it. And so I did. And I strayed from the manuscript a whole bunch unintentionally, and it was a whirlwind. And then when I was done, I closed my mouth, and kind of like came back to like an awareness. Sorry, my husband just walked in. Came back to awareness and was like, what have I done? Like, that was horrible. What did I just say? That must have been horrible. And I'm just kind of like shocked for a second. And then my class just like erupts in applause and gives me a standing ovation. And then I look back at my parents and they're just like weeping. And then I look at Dr. Fleer and like he's like a big manly man. He's emotional, but he's like a big guy. And his eyes are watering. And he said, class, I think we just witnessed what it looks like for somebody to stumble into their calling. And I was the way I'll describe it now is it was both the most affirming moment of my life and the most utterly terrifying moment of my life. And I didn't really know what to do. I'm sure the preachers that followed me were great, but I couldn't pay attention. I was freaking out. So after that class, I went back to my apartment and just like cried and cried and cried and cried. And I was like, I mean, you're going to have to put this together for me, God. Like, if this is really my calling, like,
how? Yeah, like how?
It's an insurmountable mountain. Like, I can't do this myself. So I'm just going to need you to make this happen if it's really what I'm supposed to do, because I can't. And I decided in that moment I was never going to force it. That I was going to trust God to open the doors when the time was appropriate, and that I was going to let co-ministers and fellow seminarians and male classmates and mentors open those doors, and I was never going to push them open. And it's worked out pretty well. So
yeah, I think probably one of the best things we can do is almost just sort of relax a little bit.
Yeah.
Because there's already been so much tension. It's kind of like, listen, the doors are open already. It's just a matter of people kind of walking through.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know when was that you preached that? Was that like
that would have
how
been
long ago?
That would have been in 2009, 2010.
Okay.
So about 5 years ago.
Like five-ish years ago.
Yeah. So.
And I mean, between 2010 to now, I mean, it's definitely been something that, at least in the past probably year, has come sort of bubbling to the surface of Church of Christ internet viraliness,
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, oh my gosh, the women are speaking.
I know.
Yes, they have been for like 30 years.
Right?
No one has been listening.
Yeah, exactly. So.
But what? I mean, wow, that was 5 years ago, 5-ish years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and so have you? I mean, what have you? Are you in an MDiv right now?
Mm-hmm.
Or
I finished my MDiv here at ACU in August. I was doing the math the other day. Between 2010, I guess, is when that happened. Yeah, because I graduated December 2011, so that would have been spring 2000, or maybe it was spring 2011. Yeah, I think. Anyways, between then and now, I have preached just under, or maybe right around 60 sermons.
wow.
I got a few opportunities here and there, but really most of that happened when I moved out to Abilene. The faculty here has been really dedicated to helping me develop my skill, and Dr. Sensing, in particular, he's the homiletics professor here, and he helped me get this preaching gig where I was preaching every Sunday for a year. And at a small
In
town.
Abilene?
Mhm. And so that was really awesome. I did that for a whole year. And I could still be doing that, except the congregation was all old, elderly, all elderly white people. Like the youngest person was 65. And, I'm married, and my husband really needed like an active community to be a part of. Um,
Yeah.
every minister kind of has to remember to consider their family members, and that's something I needed to do. So yeah.
Yeah, it's the churches of Christ are plentiful out there.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was in Boston for 5 years, so
Oh wow.
uh so not as plentiful.
No.
That's for sure.
Nope. Yeah, they're all over the place
But
here.
they are the ones that are there are pretty good.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so you did that, wow. So you did a whole year of Sunday preaching at a little Church of Christ church in Abilene, or?
In Abilene. And by the time I got there, it was kind of a hodgepodge of denominations. It started off as a Church of Christ chapel, and then, but the setup was kind of Methodist. Like there was a Methodist preacher there for a while, and then but then I guess ACU started sending a lot of students over, so they had a Church of Christ preacher for a little bit before I got there. And so everybody that's there is kind of this weird hodgepodge of like Methodists and Church of Christ and non-denominational, and yeah.
So have you? I mean, so that's it. That's an interesting sort of situation. I mean, again, it's foreign to me. But have you? What other like sort of venues have you preached in or spoken? Um, yeah. Have
Yeah.
you or in other churches maybe?
Mhm. There's a Church of Christ in Irving, Texas. That's near Dallas, right by the airport. Um, that let me come preach one Sunday morning, and they do a really good job of having women come out every now and then. So that was really cool. That was the first time I ever preached in a Church of Christ. And when I got the news that I was going to get to do that, I was just in utter shock because I'm not a pessimist. I like to say I'm a realist. But I just assumed the realist in me didn't, I don't like to set myself up for disappointment. So I just assumed that I won't get to preach in a Church of Christ till I'm like 65. Like I went ahead and set that bar way over there so that like I wouldn't be disappointed. And so, I guess I was 23, 22 or 23 when I first got to preach in a Church of Christ on a Sunday morning. And that's still, when I think about it, is just mind-boggling. And then there's
It's true because like 10 years ago, it wasn't even in our minds.
right, exactly. And so then there's a well, we're members at Highland Church of Christ now, and Highland has two satellite churches, sort of. They're like outreach church plants in town. And so one of their little church plants let me preach one night. And so that was another Church of Christ that I got to preach in. And then there's a Church of Christ in Georgia, in Tyrone, Georgia, that let me preach a Sunday during Christmas break when I went back to Atlanta to visit family. So it's been really kind of crazy.
What does somebody just know you and it's like, hey, we should get her to preach, or do like you send them an email?
Pop open either as a result of my professors here, like they always are in these different conversations. So anytime somebody's like, well, we would let a woman preach, but we just don't know any. My professors are always like, we have that one. That's helpful.
Yeah.
And then also a couple of people that have expressed interest or wanting me to come out and preach. heard me at Summit or they heard me at Pepperdine lectures. And so that's how the church in Tyrone found me, is they heard me speak at Summit. So
I guess I hadn't actually. It's interesting because it hasn't even occurred to me the idea that there are churches of Christ out there that are looking for someone to just come out who's a woman and preach.
Yeah. Well,
like even that idea is sort of just like it's weird in my mind.
Well, yeah. It's I mean, I think it's particularly interesting because it's a little bit of a catch-22 for women, because for the churches that are like, hey, we would do this, but there are no women preachers, or even people who refuse to change their minds because they fall back on, oh, there are no women preachers, or, you know, we don't have any in our area or in our church. The other issue is you haven't brought up women preachers. Like, you haven't trained them. You haven't allowed them. So whereas you're letting, this is getting on a tangent, whereas you let your 11-year-old son have the authority to preach a sermon before the church, but you don't let the 75-year-old woman be even worthy to pass out a communion tray, you can't expect women to all of a sudden just know how to preach or know how to carry that authority or know how to speak confidently. That's not going to happen overnight. Mm-hmm. And so if churches are eager or interested, then they need to be investing in their young girls and bringing up that confidence and that ability, you know?
Yeah. It is, and again, like, it's probably just, like, coming from that background, it's just, it doesn't, it's like it just doesn't occur to you sometimes until it's, like, right in your face, and sometimes it's like, oh, no, I have to make a decision, like, no. You know?
Absolutely.
But in some ways, like, I understand, like, a very sort of conservative Church of Christ background and sort of how it can be very, it like you said, it doesn't happen overnight, you know, it's a very glacier-like movement, you know. Like I said, you know, Diesta Love and, like, the Brookline Church of Christ have had women in the pulpit for 30 years, like, it's been happening for a while, but, you know, it just hasn't been, it's a glacier, you know, it's a glacier. But, you know, there's always a tipping point, so. And I'm just curious, sort of changing the subject a little bit. I feel like we could probably talk about Church of Christ women forever. What have you looked at the text at all for this week that you're preaching?
I glanced over it. I'm working on a few different sermons right now, so I need to refresh my memory if you want to talk about it.
Understandable. I was just curious because I just glanced at them, and it's basically, so if you're familiar with the the liturgical calendar, today is Fat Tuesday, so Mardi Gras, tomorrow starts Lent, and then Sunday is the first Sunday in Lent, and what's coming up is basically it's like Jesus' baptism, it's the story of Noah, it's a 1 Peter reading about baptism.
Right.
And so you get a nice baptism day if you choose to accept it. You can go, there's a few different ways you can go, but I was like, there's a lot of water involved this
it will be good. It will be really good.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure it will be good. But I was just curious because I'm new to doing these interviews, and I'm not sure. I know that doing them a little bit beforehand, not everyone is necessarily going to be prepared to talk about whatever they're going to talk about.
Right. Yeah.
Fine. But what kinds of resources do you use when putting together a sermon?
Yeah. First and foremost, I'm a book hoarder. I love books. I like to have my own books. So I started this in undergrad, and, like, this is a big financial investment, so I understand if students can't do this, but I decided in undergrad that I was just going to have my own books because I knew this is what I'm going to do, and I can always use those books. And so in undergrad, I started collecting all the commentaries I use, and all the texts required for different classes, and theology texts, and church history texts, and so I just started developing that collection in undergrad, and now I have, like, a very sizable collection. that I've continued to grow in grad school. And so I'm fortunate to have enough to have my own library, really, at my disposal. So it depends on the kind of sermon I'm going to preach, which also depends on context, honestly.
Actually, kind of going off like context, I was kind of wondering, like, when you're preaching, I mean, it depends on your audience, old, young, college students, Church of Christ, not Church of Christ, Christian or not Christian or less Christian, how much time you have even,
Yeah.
all kind of goes in. But the podcast venue is a very, very strange place.
Yeah.
Where it just goes into the void.
It's super awkward. Actually, for my last, for the podcast I did before, I actually made my dad, like I started to preach into the computer, and I was like, I can't do this. And so I made my dad come into the bathroom. I had the bathroom because of the acoustics. I made him come into the bathroom, and I was like, I need you to just sit here and like look me in the eyes and listen with your face, but don't say anything.
But don't say anything.
That's how I sit.
That's all. No, that's awesome because I know, like, I kind of want to address this because it's something that I mean, I've been sort of just musing about because, you know, I mean, it's preaching and it's sermons, and it might be just for the podcast. Some people are sharing sermons that they've preached before or in churches or actually in the church.
Yeah.
And it's just a strange venue where, I don't know, it just it's almost like you can do whatever you want to do, and you hope that someone somewhere will latch onto something, just kind of like sometimes normal preaching.
Yeah. Yeah, honestly, okay, I hope this does not come across the wrong way, but when I was preaching for this chapel in town, it's called Wisteria Place Chapel, and like I said, it was an elderly crowd, and many of our congregants were pretty well into dementia. Like several of them, like maybe wouldn't even remember me week to week. Like they would come up and reintroduce themselves, or be like, you know, you must be the new preacher, and I had been there for 7 months. You know, like it's just, you know. And so when I would preach, like some of them can't even really hear well, and so it was like a pretty. This is not meant to be offensive, but a pretty dead crowd. Like, yeah, and
all right.
I got really used to that, and honestly, it was a really good challenge because nothing is harder to do than like preach to people you aren't certain are listening. And so I learned how to do that, and so honestly, preaching to the podcast was maybe just a little bit harder than that, but not too much. So. Yeah, but context just has so much to do with it. I've preached for ACU undergrad chapel before, and I think college students are probably the toughest crowd. And so you just kind of go in knowing, like, hey, half these kids like don't even want to be here right now. So how can I take that into consideration, and what am I gonna do to connect with them?
They're yik-yakking.
You know? Yeah, they're yik-yakking. So. Like, how yik-yak's positive. And so...
Just yik-yak back while you're on stage.
Yeah, I just yik-yak the whole sermon. Just get up there with my phone.
This is a new thing I can venture into.
It's a new
yik-yak sermons.
I mean, yeah. No, but, yik-yak does need some Jesus, though.
But I'm curious sort of people's experience doing the podcast, because I would say maybe 2/3 of them the sermons have been just sort of just for the podcast, like, you know, an experience for people to write maybe who haven't done sermons before.
Yeah.
Or people who have and have time. But also, you know, people who preach every Sunday, you know, who there's, you know, because I've had them, and it's like, I don't have time to write another sermon here. Just take what I've said on Sunday. I'm like, all right, I will take that. Yeah. And it's, you know, it's different because it's just a different experience. But if you listen to podcasts, you can find them to be very they can be almost as physical sometimes as, I mean, if you really get into them. It just depends. Yeah. They can be as...
You have to imagine people tuning in. Like you have to imagine people listening. You have to imagine all of that, which I mean, preaching requires a great deal of imagination as it is,
Sure.
a lot of social imagination, and so I think, yeah, maybe like the trick to preaching for a podcast is just deeply, deeply imagining who your sermon is going to go to. Like before
Mhm.
you even sign in to start preaching, like just go ahead and picture who those people are, what kind of situations they're in, like where do you have to be to listen to the podcast? Well, maybe in the car or like at work with earphones in or going for a jog. Like that's who's listening. So how do you meet them?
That's true. Yeah, and like I said, I'm still figuring it out. But I'm just sort of curious about everyone's experience
Yeah.
because it is a strange one, and I'm just admitting that openly. Um, uh, so I've gotten a lot from you. You've answered most of my questions in everything that you've said, but so I guess I have a couple of questions, two in particular. One, your most memorable experience of a sermon that was preached to you. So like a sermon that basically just like is extremely memorable or um, somehow touched you in a way that like you could never forget it. And then secondly, a sermon that you've preached that literally or figuratively has like made your knees shake, where you're like, that, like, and I mean, you gave the story of the first one. If it's the first one, just say it's the first one. But if there was because you preached a lot, if there was another one where you could say, yeah, that was terrifying, or that was like just based on the subject matter or whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm. I may have to think for a minute. Let's see.
that's okay.
Maybe you can edit
This is what,
out
and
whatever.
this is what, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, I can edit. I can edit all of it.
You can. Okay. Then let me think for a minute.
No problem.
Um, There have been so many sermons that have shaped me. um, hmm, so many. Which one am I gonna go with? um, hmm, hmm. Sorry, it shouldn't be this hard to pick one, but it
It's
is.
okay. It's kind of a tough question.
It is. Let me think. Um, hmm. Well, it's so hard to pick just one. uh,
Or is there like something about certain people? Is it like one person or multiple people,
yeah,
or is it a certain subject matter or a charisma?
yeah. Let me go with that because that'll be more accurate, anyways. Um, hang on, my husband just texted me. I know I shouldn't be texting while we're doing this.
It's okay. We should be wrapping up soon anyway.
No, you're good. So yeah, the preaching that shaped me. I mean, it's obvious to say my dad shaped me. And my dad's not perfect. Like, I don't idolize him in an inappropriate way. But he's very much a mentor to me. And we actually do, when we talk, we have to distinguish, like, we'll say, this is a daddy-daughter conversation, or we'll say, hey, this is a preacher-to-preacher conversation. And there's a distinction there. Like, there really is. And sometimes I'll say, hey, this is a mixed conversation if I need, like, personal advice, but um, obviously he shaped me as my dad, but also as a preacher, he, um, my dad, he was able to demonstrate, um, oh, I'm almost at a loss for words. What my dad was able to do is, on Sundays he would preach a message of reconciliation, fundamentally. I guess I don't want to say that his sermons were, all about social justice, because that almost gives the wrong impression. My dad's sermons are about the mission of God. My dad's sermons are about God's restoring work in the world. And so I grew up in a church that took very seriously the work of reconciliation. That means my church is incredibly racially diverse. My church is socioeconomically diverse. My church is back home is one that takes seriously the call to serve and act and to walk the talk. And I watched my dad preach that and live that. And so that just profoundly shaped who I am. It profoundly shaped my approach to preaching. I have a very hard time imagining preaching detached from the pastoral office. I think preaching is just as much what you're doing, when you're not behind the pulpit. Preaching is what you're doing in the hospital visits. Preaching is the way you live life with your family. It's the way that you engage in casual conversations. It's in the way you serve your community. You live preaching. And so it's hard for me to pick one sermon because it's a life that I saw.
Okay. I see what you're saying.
And it's a life that now I've gotten to choose. And so, and Barbara Brown Taylor communicates a similar principle in her book, The Preaching Life. This idea that preaching is not a sermon series. It's not just a strong command of words. That preaching is your life. And it's in the way you live. It's in the way you engage. It's in the way you love. And so, yeah, that's really it for me. When you ask me if one sermon stands out, I think of all these preachers who feed in to this preaching life, like my dad and Dr. Jerry Taylor and Josh Graves in Nashville and Jonathan Stormont here in Abilene and Mike Cope and Diesta Love and Sarah Barton and just a number of people who just, that's where my mind goes, the preaching lives that surround me. So, yeah.
That's cool.
So, I guess to the second question, when I was preaching at Wisteria Place, a lot of these people are dying, and they know. And, the majority of the congregation is in their 80s or even their 90s. And many of them are, living in the nursing home that's just across the way. That's why they go to Wisteria Place Chapel, is because they can get their wheelchair there and the nurses will wheel them over. And so that's where they go. And realizing that I had a choice when I took the position. I could choose to preach the kind of sermons I hope to preach to another church someday, or I could choose to allow my context to be as specific as it was. And I chose to engage a very specific context. And so I preached, I did a couple of different series addressing death, just really upfront, and that was really hard to do. But the one that really rocked my world was a series I did on creation, and I called it Recreation. And it was a series that really took a good hard look at life and death and examined the way that God is recreating and replenishing life all around us. And so we spent some time in Genesis, but we also, just traveled through Scripture and observed the creation language that's all throughout Scripture. And we ended in Revelation, and the whole sermon writing process for that series was very emotional for me. I lost my grandfather last year, and so the idea of preaching something that's not just relevant to my congregation, but something that's also very close to home, it was just a very powerful series for me to engage. And of course, I think any preacher will say, that when writing a sermon, if you really dedicate yourself to it, it's kind of like going under the knife. Like you're allowing the Word of God to cut you open, and kind of testing it out before you share it with anybody else, and allowing it to expose yourself, and allowing it to pierce those parts of you that you would rather keep hidden sometimes. And so for me, that series did that. It addressed death anxiety. It addressed my grief over my grandfather. It addressed my fear of losing people I love, and addressed everything that my congregation was wrestling with. And there was no hiding, and we worked through it as a congregation. And so that was a really cool experience.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. And I mean, it's interesting how you said how, you had a choice. Like, I could pretend like I'm preaching for some future congregation, or I can preach in the context that I'm in now. And I mean, I would be willing to bet most of the time you probably should be as sort of present to your context as you should be. And even if you're like, oh, this has nothing to do with me, somehow it will find you. It will find you, and it will find everyone else too. Now, thank you so much for sharing. Quickly, just sort of changing the subject, I kind of like end out the conversation a little bit lighter. Very quickly. Cool. And real quick question: have you ever done a wedding?
Sort of.
What? You have.
A little, kind of.
Wait, did you like? I'm just. That's really funny because that was unexpected answer.
There was a couple at the nursing home across from Wisteria Place that wanted to do they wanted to renew their wedding vows and have a wedding ceremony. And so I didn't legally marry them, but they wanted me to officiate their wedding ceremony. So we had a wedding ceremony, and it was kind of a nice little practice round for me. But I didn't know what to expect when I got there. I didn't know if it would feel like a wedding or if it would feel like a, who knows, something else. Okay. But everybody was dressed up, and all the nurses were like, "Are you here to officiate the wedding? It's the big wedding day. It's a big wedding day," and they had flowers, and it was a wedding. So.
That's awesome. That's good. I mean, I'm sure there's more to that story, but that's good. My question was going to be, have you done a wedding? If the answer was no, it would be, would you? But clearly the answer is yes.
Yeah, I would love to. So.
All right. Well, we heard it here. And another question, just sort of, I've been trying to think of strange questions to ask people that have nothing to do with anything. How about, what was the last song you danced to?
Oh, man.
Admit it, whatever it was.
Yeah, well, I've got to think of what it was. I know it was just yesterday. I dance on a regular basis. It was probably, oh my gosh, what was it? I was watching... It was
on the radio.
Yeah. Oh. What's that? What's the funk?
Shake It Off.
Song. What's the funk song that's really big right now?
Oh yeah, Uptown Funk.
Uptown Funk. That was it. Yeah, it was on SNL. I was watching SNL on Netflix or Hulu or something.
All right, good one. That's a good choice for dancing. Let's see. What's another good question? I haven't asked this one yet. what is your best or strangest celebrity encounter?
Ooh. Um, let's see, best or strangest?
Yeah,
Um,
but it could be both.
well, in Atlanta, we have like a lot of celebrities, and one day it was Mother's Day, and my mom and I were at Starbucks, and none other than Usher walked into Starbucks, and he had his sunglasses on. I knew it was him because like he had his sunglasses on, and he had like a Hummer pulled up outside of Starbucks, but like he didn't even park it. Like it was just like out in the middle of the road. I was like, okay, who else would do this? And so he walks in. I was like, Mom, that's Usher. And she was like, who? And I was like, it's Usher. She was like, I don't know who that is. And I was like, it's like he's like an R&B artist. And she was like, oh, does your brother Jerome listen to him? I was like, yeah, he has a poster or something, like really big fan. And she was like, oh my gosh, I need to go get his autograph. And I was like, okay. So like I send my mom up and he's like trying to order his Starbucks drink and she goes up and she was like, excuse me, are you Usher? And he said, yes. And she goes, can you sign my arm? And he was like, are you serious? She's like, please, my son's a really big fan. And he was like, do you have a pen? And so the Starbucks barista like hands her a permanent marker and he signs her arm. And then she goes home and my brother's like blasting hip hop music. And she knocks on his door and she goes, Jerome, are you listening to Usher again? And she like pretends to be mad. And he was like, no, ma'am. And she goes, I think you will. And he was like, no, I'm not. And she's like, well, you may listen to Usher, but I meet Usher. And she like holds up her arm. It's ridiculous.
That's and that's a good story because just the fact that she got him to sign her arm, it was probably
Right.
like okay, because he could have been like no.
Yeah, I know. Like, I think he almost wanted to say no.
But then probably just couldn't do it. Cause like that's a good one. All right. That was good. That was a good story. I had one. Who question? I don't know if I've asked you or maybe I have. If you were going to like list, be like, have these people on your podcast or try to get them, who would they be or who do you think might be interested?
In your podcast?
Yeah, like just anyone who you think might be interested.
Well,
I mean, I'll tell you if I've heard.
We probably know like all the same people. Like the obvious go-tos would be like Jen Christie and Sarah Barton and Diesta Love and
Yep.
and
They're all like they're on what is it? Container? What is the word I'm thinking of? Anyway.
yeah, Amy Bose Henniger. Do you know
who?
her? Amy Bose. Oh no.
Oh yes. No, I do.
How do you pronounce that last part? Henniger or Henniger?
Henniger, I think. I don't know.
Okay. I'm always nervous to say it because I never know. And I imagine that's how people feel about my name.
I almost got it right.
Yeah.
Amy Bose Henniger, yeah, I know them. DS Love or someone else sent me another name. Someone I think at Rochester. I don't know. I have a long list, but I'm always trying to add to it.
Yeah.
So.
You might. You know who you should get? I'm sure you have because you alluded to craziness on the internet. But have you heard of Lauren King?
Yes. No. She's already on the schedule.
Oh, good. He's great. She's really great. I heard her. Jeff Walling asked me to judge like a preaching competition thing that was out at Pepperdine, and so I really actually don't know much about it, but he sent me a bunch of videos and asked me to judge, and she was one of the finalists, and she really is very good.
We could talk about the internet craziness with that because my Facebook wall was posted with extremes on both ends.
Yeah.
No, yeah, she's preaching during Lent, I believe. So wait, is it during? I don't know. She's on my calendar. Let's see. Where is it? Dun, dun. Yeah, it's during Lent.
You should
March
also,
4th.
you could also try to hunt down a girl named Lauren Calvin.
I don't know that one.
She's a Lipscomb graduate, and right now she's out at.
Calvin?
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah, Lauren Calvin. Um, she's younger than me, but she apparently she was preaching out at Lipscomb. I never heard her, but
okay.
um, who else? That might be all I can think of right now.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much
Yeah,
for
please
chatting with
edit
me.
this thing down. Like you edit this thing like crazy.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's very exciting to edit. Um,
That does not sound exciting at all.
I get to listen to how many times I nervous laugh and
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I'm just asking that you would do unto me as you would do to yourself. Please edit out my nervous laughter and my
or as many ums as you can get rid of,
yeah,
or like,
please.
get to the point page and just skip that part. Delete.
Yep.
Um, no, yeah, I'll edit it down.
Cool.
And you know the drill. Give me the sermon sometime, and I will post it as soon as I possibly can, as
Yeah.
soon as I get it.
Cool.
But thanks again.
Yeah,
Have a
thank you.
good rest of your week. If you would you want to preach again? You seem very busy, but summer is coming very quickly.
I was gonna say, and I mean, I have my last MDiv class in May.
hmm
So I don't even know what comes next. I'm waiting for one of those doors to fling open, so we'll see. But I'm probably gonna have
All
some
right.
time on
And
my.
like that, those sort of like later in the, I think basically after the Pepperdine lectures, I think Sarah Barton opens up, Jen Christie opens up. Like they've been like, I can't do anything until after May.
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah,
okay, understandable.
cool.
And they're all writing dissertations and things, so
Yeah,
excuses.
right. Well, yeah,
Anyway,
anytime. You just let me know. I'd be happy to. So.
all right. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Have a good night.
you
Have a good
too. Have to
weekend.
hang up. I don't even know how.
I will stop the broadcast.
Thanks. All
Bye.
right, bye.